So today we're going to be looking at the parish of FODDERTY, which is in the centre of the Highlands of Scotland. Very interesting parish, and a lot of McLennans there, we'll learn later. Quite a big number came, and many went out to all sorts of parts of the world from there too. They seem to be very good travellers. The research was initially done by Joyce Willard, who's with us today, and Joyce is going to share part of the presentation about her own family. That'll be great. Thank you very much for that, Joyce. We do appreciate the work you all do for contributing these research things, and everybody who does it says how much they enjoy doing research on a particular parish. So we'll be mainly using the old statistical account to come up with some thoughts of what life was like in the 1790s for people, our ancestors and others who lived there. And we'll look to do that. We'll look at the sort of topography we find there, where it is in relation to other places, what the people were like, what their health and housing was like, who lived there, what some McLennans who lived there, who the owners were, and the minister, some ministers, and just to finish off a few curiosities about this particular parish. It's a very interesting one. So this account that we're going to look at as the core information was written in 1793. That's a long time ago. You can see here the first page of the statistical account, and you can see here, I'll just turn on the pointer. You can see the minister, Reverend Donald Mackenzie, was the author of this statistical account. He knows this parish. It's quite interesting to think who he is, because how well does he know? Is he just a blow-in, or does he know a bit about the parish? Well, he knows a lot about this parish because not only is he the current minister and has been for a while, but his father was the minister before that, and his father had been the minister before that from quite a few years before our Donald here was born. So he certainly knows it. He's grown up there in this parish. I'll, rather than read from here, I'll read this little section that's in here in the old statistic account. The name of this parish is of Gaelic etymology. In that language, it consists of two words that are nearly descriptive of its function. Foi rub, or a meadow along the side of a hill. Some Gaelic speakers yesterday told me he didn't actually say that at all. There was no mention of a hill in this couple of words. It just means a meadow alongside, actually. But anyway, that's what it's talking about. And it refers, he says, to the principal part of the parish that lies in a valley surrounded with hills to the north, west and south, with an extensive opening to the east. There, the valley, it has a commanding view of the town and parish of Dingwall, which of course we dealt with a couple of meetings ago. That lies to the northeast of the valley. The name of the valley is the Strathpeffer. So the thing we take away from that is that he's talking about the principal part of the parish. And by that he means the bit that people live in, as opposed to the biggest part of the area of the parish. In fact, there's quite a lot of parish that is not inhabited. As we've seen in many others, but in this one it's particularly noticeable because it's really a relatively small part, and we won't actually deal with the rest of the parish at all in this session today because there are so few people live in the rest that is not the Strathpeffer that's referred to here. He does say, I'm just giving you a little bit of a romantic talk here, a bit of a blurb, you know, talk it up. He says that there are great numbers of plots of ash, hazel and alderwood interspersed with the cornfields along this valley. When these and the fields around are in verdure, it forms a beautiful scene. Ah, isn't that a nice thing? So let's just get our bearings about where this parish is in relation to the rest of the Ross-shire. So, you know, we've been dealing with other parishes. Last time we dealt with this Gairloch parish over here, and previously we've dealt with Loch Broom. Next time we're going to be dealing with Applecross. That's a bit of a talk up there, a bit of a shout out. It's a really good parish. So romantic, Applecross. But let's deal with this one first. We've dealt with Dingwall. That was a parish we did just a couple of meetings ago. And this parish we're talking about today is in here beside Dingwall. you might say that it goes down to the lock, this lock here, although it doesn't actually show there, almost doesn't show Dingwall goes down to the lock, but the river, that's the Conan that we've talked about before, is tidal up in this little section in here. So you might say it has salt water in front, you know, is connected to the sea, you might say. But the point is, this is about 50 kilometres across here. So, you know, it's reasonably long. And you can see from that picture that it goes further to the west than any of these other parishes that are coming down onto the Cromarty Firth. And actually, if you lived up here, for example, you would be much closer to the Clachan. You remember the Clachan Church, the centre of Loch Broom activity in the 1700s, is here. So really, look, it's only a short distance. You want to go all the way down here to the. I'll just mute.
Okay. Just because you won't know when she's coming.
I'll just mute that.
Right.
1 second.
Hello. Right. Yes, there you are. Okay. I told her to call you when she's in the driveway.
Okay. Aspect, sorry. You're not muted, Shari. I've done you now. Okay, so coming back to the map, here we've got the parish here, and it's quite long, goes up to there. It's got a few little pockets, just a handful up here. He says 3/4 of the people all live in this valley down here. Okay, so it's and by comparison with the size of others, you remember that when we looked at Loch Broom, it was over 1,000 square kilometres, and Gairloch is about 3/4 of that. This one is quite a lot smaller by comparison. It's 191 square kilometres only. So, you know, whilst it's long, it's not terribly wide, is what that means. You can see that there. So here's another more accurate map of superimposed over a modern map of the parish as it was in the 1790s. And one interesting, you can see here where it comes down to the river, the tidal end of the river, which we know is quite muddy out here in front of Dingwall, don't we? And just while we're still on this farthest away part, the mountain, Ben Wyvis, is actually here, and it's just inside the boundary. So if you want to be technical, Ben Wyvis is in FODDERTY Parish, but you know, clearly the idea was that the boundary went along the ridge, the top of the ridge. And so that's in there. Now, focusing on this valley in here, as he says, you've got a spectacular view down to the town and parish of Dingwall from this valley, this strath in here. And the strath basically follows this orange line, which is the road. That grey line there is the railway, you know, a much more recent thing than the period we're talking about. Came in the 1860s. Comes from Dingwall around and goes crosses. You can see that loop there that the railway goes up. I'll use that again in a minute. And I want you to mainly focus on this little blue patch in here, which is a lock. That's your sort of reference point for future correspondence. And most people live in this little area just in here. That's where they live. So that's called Loch Usi. You can see the name down here on the left of the screen. So here's a southern end of the parish now we're looking at, and here's where we're looking at Dingwall across here. Here's Loch Usi in here. You can see the modern town of Strathpeffer, which did not exist at the time of our statistical account. And you can also see a place called Maryborough, which again is a new town, didn't come into being until the 1820s. So that's, and you can see Ben Wyvis up here. So that's the sort of the big picture of where that is. Most people live in here. That's what that note there says. And the valley, really it's the hinterland of Dingwall. That's the better way of thinking of it. This river that flows down, the River Peffer, or the Peffer water, is the river that we saw when we looked at the Dingwall parish. You remember they put a channel in later in the 1800s into the middle of the town for the river, and to try and make it navigable. So this is an old map that, you know, doesn't have those places that came along more recently. It does go beyond the parish we're looking at, but here's Loch Usi again in here. And here's a place called Balblair, which is a name you see reasonably often in Scotland. There's one in the Strathconan and other places. That is where Maryborough is today. You can see the River Conan spelt with an A, as it often was in those days, coming down here. And this, of course, is the Blackwater going up here. And that's not really where the Conton Church is. Really, it's on this island here. They're a bit out, some of these measurements here. You remember we talked about how the Mackenzies of Gairloch, when we were looking at Gairloch, the Mackenzies of Gairloch were building a second house in on the eastern side that was called Conan House. Well, look, here it is. That's the house the Mackenzies built that we were told in the 1800s. By that time, they were living half in Gairloch and at Flowerdale and half here at Conan House. So that's it. And you've got Conan Bridge there now. So this is the, Black Isle out here. This is Urquhart and Logie Wester, or Ferntosh, as you might call it, on this side. So looking in more detail, you can see here it does have the word Strathpeffer there, but it's actually not referring to a village, it's referring to the valley, isn't it? And you can see here the place FODDERTY is mentioned. Now that's where the church, the kirk, is there in the 1790s. This map is actually an 1820 map, and so here it says FODDERTY Kirk there, but that's was built in the early 1800s. The one that we're dealing with is actually over here on the south side of the Peffery River. That's that wiggly snake there on the south side. That's where it is. There are a number of other sort of castles and whatnot. You can see here, of course, the big one that we know all about, Bran Castle, the Mackenzie HQ is there, as well as Conan House. And we've got Cool, that's another Mackenzie, castle type house. And most importantly for this parish, though, you've got Castle Leod up here, which is the one within FODDERTY. None of these others are within FODDERTY. And Tulloch that we looked at when we looked at the Dingwall parish. So, you've got quite a few sort of establishments, and that's because this is such a strategically important area for all manner of people, not just Vikings, but who would pass from here across to the west coast through this strategic pass in the mountains. And you need these fortifications and whatnot, castles and things in here to guard the passage, take control of it, you might say. Another one here, you can just make out, you see down there the letter F, that's Fairburn, right? It's another Mackenzie stronghold with the famous tower. And so strategic. And here we've got this thing, you see in here it says Knock Farrell. It's spelled here F-A-R-R-I-L, a vitrified fort. You might even see vitreous, anyway, that's what they call it, vitrified fort, meaning glass-like. It means that the walls have been turned into glass. That's pretty special. And that's right here in the middle of this whole valley that we're looking at. Okay, we're going to focus a little bit later on the area around here where we have quite a bit of activity, like economic activity in later times. So that's just giving you a bit of a feel for the lie of the land in the 1700s with this 1820 map. Now, look, here's the places that are going to be on the exam here, right? You better pay attention now. So we're homing in just on this valley. We know that the parish goes for another 40 kilometres to the northwest from here, but this is just this area that is so heavily worked. You've got Loch Usie there again. That's quite a big loch. You can see it there. A bit of that might be forest, that darker colour, but that's still quite a big thing. You can see the river. It comes out in Dingwall. We know that, don't we? And actually this little V shape in there, that's a part of the river. It's not much of a river. Certainly you wouldn't be putting ships along it. More like a stream or a burn or a creek, as we might say. And it comes up here and then it heads in that direction up there from that point, although several other maps mark it in other directions, feeding in at this point and coming out to Dingwall. So there's the village of FODDERTY, or the locality almost, where the kirk was in the 1790s. You can make out the railway here if you really look closely. You see that just where the Y is, and then going north there's that same loop that we saw on the other map before, and it goes across. It's a funny thing, you know, because when they were putting the railway in the 1860s, the people at Strathpeffer said they didn't want any, you know, smoking, belching, flame-throwing machines coming into their beautiful village. Thank you very much. But of course, in the end, it was the railway that was the making of Strathpeffer, because it brought people to take the waters here to town. They had to make a coach service, and they were talking about branch lines and so on at one stage. So it was funny how they resisted the train and held up the train line being built for a while they negotiated and agreed that they would take it up there and then across north. This goes along a ridge over here. Along here, you have quite a lot of places that are called heights of this and heights of that. I've only put a couple on the examinable list. One is heights of Achterneed. That's one that's there. And there are other things called heights of FODDERTY, heights of Keppoch, heights of Bray. There's a place there called Bray. That's along here. You've got all these heights, and there's a sort of ridge you can drive along beside the railway line, still to this day. Quite a nice view from there. And when you get to the end, you've got this little bit of a valley going up there, and Castle Leod is famous. You can go sometimes and you know, look over the castle, but only like once every couple of years they open it up for inspection. Then coming down to this part down here, we're just dealing with places within the FODDERTY Parish now. You've got this place at the time that's called Balblair that we saw on the other map. And these places in the square brackets, that built up area there is Maryborough now, quite a built up area. And this is the modern Conan Bridge. There, and this is, it was called Conan Village at first, and then later called Conan Bridge Village. Conan Bridge, that's the name that's used now. And then you've got over here Strathpeffer. That's a modern place and it didn't exist in that time. That's why it's in those parentheses. Is that what we call them, Catherine? Parentheses, square brackets, I'll call them. And then we've got this unusual place over here that you might have heard of called Jamestown. When the disruption happened in the 1843, you know, the church in Scotland was split in half, basically, so that half became free church and half kept the established church. And congregations had to decide, and sometimes ministers and congregations didn't agree and so on. But in this part of the world, they were generally kept as established churches. And but they came up with this compromise that they would make a little patch where the three parishes joined. Where FODDERTY, Urry and Conton all came together. There was a point, and they would make a village there that would be a free church village and could have a free church, you know, life. And so this little town grew up at that time. So it's well after the time we're talking about, the 1790s. Yeah, and this is my use of the maps from the hill forts thing, and you can see that that orange dot is in there. That's telling you this is where that vitrified fort is. Hill, you see down here, hill forts is where I got this aerial photo from. Yeah, there are a few other places too, Carnock and Kinloch Lewishart, and Keithtown is down here, you know, a few other places, but they won't be on the exam, those other places. I don't know whether now's the right time, but I'll do it now just because I can. And that is to say, you'll sometimes find people who just appear to be Strathconan people for sure. You know, you think these are people who just have nothing to do with FODDERTY. What's going on here? When you see them being recorded as having married or baptized or whatever in FODDERTY Parish, you think, what's that all about? And the answer is that quite often the ministers from FODDERTY would have responsibilities for doing some of that sort of work in the Strathconan area. So they probably went there with their register, you know, their book, and baptised and married outside their normal area. So if you see, you know, you don't think this can't be my one because they're being baptised or married in FODDERTY, because they could well still be. It might have all happened in the Strathconan. The people never went to FODDERTY, but the minister might have gone and done his missionary type work in that part. And the other thing you should hear about and then forget today is that mineral springs were not such a big deal in those days in this part of the world. Although today the Strathpeffer is famous for its mineral waters. That was certainly not the case in the 1790s. He does say, though, the minister, that that there are several sulphur springs here in this area, and he says that one for 20 years or so has been of some note. Sulphur springs. He says they're all the same, by the way, although people claim they have different, you know, degrees of sulphurousness. I don't know if you've ever been to these sulphur places, but I went to quite a few in Italy at one stage. Terme, they're called in Italy. We had to throw away some clothes after going to one of these places. They were so stinking of sulphur. Oh dear. Anyway, so he says, but this is the interesting thing. You know, it's quite a gentrified place in the late 1800s, the Strathpeffer, the village. But he says great numbers of the lower class of people come from counties of Inverness, Sutherland, and western districts of Ross-shire, and have and use the water of this mineral for all kinds of disorders without exception. The lower classes of people come, do you mind? He says that it seemed to be of most benefit for scurvy type ailments. Better to eat a lemon, I think, than go and dip yourself in sulphur, although I don't know. Or external body sores. Imagine having your bath in a bath with someone who's just been in with their external body sores. How good would that be? Pretty yucky, I reckon. And also he says they had some success with gravel and stomach complaints. Who knows what it did really? But anyway, that's, you know, in Europe they have these, in Germany anyway, they have these, I think Italy as well, they have Kur, you know, that's the German word for a cure. But that means they have a holiday often. People, workers in German, most German businesses offer a day off to go to your spa and lie in the hot sulphurous waters and see what it can do for you. So it's a bit bigger thing in Europe, this. So the main thing is just to note that this happened and to forget about it, because this is all well after our time, this stuff that you see there now. This is not my photo, but I have one like it. This is a spa pavilion, the sort of central big thing in the town, right in the centre of the Strathpeffer. And it was built, though, in 1880, this building. You can see the sort of period then that it existed as a major attraction. Quite a lot of wooden carvings around there, all sorts of crazy Viking type carvings. And this is a picture of the town in its heyday as a, you know, spa town with all these very Victorian-looking grand buildings. This is that same building there, the pavilion that we saw, except this is from the back. Look, but it's a lovely setting. I couldn't resist putting this in. Yeah, it's a lovely picture, isn't it? That's Ben Withers there in the distance. So let's move on to more statistical matters. The number of people who live in this parish. There are about 1,700 people live here, according to his, in the 1790s, early 1790s. And it's always interesting for us, isn't it, to compare to the number that lived there in the Webster census in 1755. And by comparison, it's gone up by 17% since Webster did his census about a generation and a half earlier. He tells us the number of kids there are under 7 which is not a whole lot of use really, but it's some use. So we can get a feel for whether the population is growing through childbirth or not. And probably it's not growing dramatically. And I would say, by comparison with many of the others we've looked at in this series, that this increase of 17% isn't anywhere near as great as some others, where we had nearly 50% increase in the parish numbers. But he does tell us the number of servants, both day servants and full-time servants, presumably, like domestic servants and farm servants and so on. Typical feudal sort of system, And he says that more than a half of those over 7 are servants of the servant class. It's interesting, isn't it? And he tells us there are 330 families. So that gives us, if you look at the numbers there, the total numbers, it gives us an average of over 5 people in a family. So that gives you a feel for the number of births and so on. I never know quite how they count, widows living alone and so on in counting a family, whether that's a family or not. But these are the numbers. Let's think about the health of these people. He says that the air throughout the parish is pure and healthy, as you might expect. There are many instances of longevity. This one, though, he says that the people living in the parish, there are several who call themselves near 90 years of age. At least he's being honest here, because nobody knows their birthday, really. And, these ones where they say there's several people that aged more than 100, they can't be, they don't know. And people just claim. At least he says that they call themselves near 90, which is probably more the truth of it. They may be over 90 or they may be quite a bit under, but they probably don't have any clue. And, probably probably illiterate by and large. He says there are no distempers other than the usual that the neighbours have, that are common in the neighbouring places. But then he says that the smallpox often rages here. This is smallpox that we see up here, of course, now since gone, and frequently proves mortal, as inoculation has never been attempted except by very few families who recently introduced it with success. There's a funny thing. The prejudice of the people is, however, very strongly against it. Are we starting this conversation we had only at the beginning of today? 1790s. There you go. I suppose I see it more as a early adopter, late adopter thing. And the same applies to farming. That's where I really learned that idea about early adopter, late adopter. Now, the sort of things they grow there, we never see wheat. Well, we don't very often. Once I think we saw some small amount of crop under wheat. He doesn't give us the areas under cultivation, or he doesn't give us the volumes produced either, for that matter. So we don't really know a lot about the actual crops. He just lists them off. It's the usual suspects. Potatoes we all know that they've only been introduced in the last generation or two, since they came from South America. But he says, and this is really important, it's the same thing as the previous slide, haven't adopted the inoculation idea. They also haven't adopted the new methods, which by this stage in the south of Britain are well understood and well practiced. In this part of the world, the idea of rotating crops, putting legumes to improve the nitrogen and those sorts of things that we all know about now, were not being adopted. All classes of farmers follow the old methods. Pretty damning, that, isn't it? Not much different to the inoculation. This is a picture of what we'd had a bit of a long discussion about this with the Scots yesterday, whether this is what it was. He says that they say they go a bit brown, and they said it's delicious. If you can get a bowl of peas, this is a peas pudding. They weren't so keen on the peas pudding. It's not green peas that they're talking about when they use this word here. It's this sort of lentil thing. They had to grow it all sorts of ways. Oh, lovely, they say. And the point he makes about them not adopting new methods of farming may or may not, it may have an impact. He says that the proprietors, that's the owners of the farms that all these farmers are using, all classes of farmers, that the proprietors haven't done anything to encourage the adoption of these new practices. By that he means that they haven't, provided long leases that would make it worthwhile for the farmers to improve the soil. They don't provide any other incentives like, lease adjustments to the rental and that sort of thing. So old practices. The other sources of income, apart from crops, like we just saw, would be some livestock. We know some parishes, the principal revenue is from black cattle and to some extent wool and sheep and so on for own consumption. And here we have an extraordinary thing. I think how amazing is the number of horses this parish has. 633 horses, that's a huge number. It's like having, like you talk about 2-car garage for the family, or 4 cars, some of them. Each family, you've got 300 and some little bit families. So you've really got more or less 2 horses for every family. Yeah, it's an extraordinary. You remember when we did locks, the local people who were there and knowledgeable about the history of locks, we were told, and the parish there had more or less the same number, a little bit more than this one, people living there. They told us that it couldn't be 420 horses or whatever they had. It's far too many, they told us. Look at this. You got half again as many in this parish. Heaven knows what they all did. Presumably it was flatter and easier. In some other places it was too hilly to use, like even draft horses or whatever. They needed small horses to scramble up the hills to bring the peats back down and so on. But here they've got quite a lot of horses. Presumably they're in work, all these horses. They're not just there for entertainment. Quite a few black cattle, although he does say that the number of black cattle has gone down a bit because of with the introduction of sheep farms. Now, that gives us a bit of a clue, and it's the only clue he gives us that there might be a bit of sheep farming going on. But when you then look at these next two here, you've got 2 types of sheep, best sheep and inferior sheep. I can only think that the inferior sheep are the ones that are like home domesticated, you might call them, or, grown for wool, their own home consumption of the wool. And these are the ones that are being farmed more like on a grand scale. So if this has been, what's happening, the number of black cattle has decreased because of the sheep farm being introduced, then 1,000 sheep to me doesn't seem like a lot. Some of you might know how many sheep you can run to the acre in Scotland. Or the Colin would know that, wouldn't you, Colin? That's your department.
No, I'm short on that knowledge, sorry.
But your ancestors would have, Colin, that you could say that.
Yeah.
But I can only think that this is a relatively small number, that sheep are not a big impact here. But the horses, extraordinary. And another source of work and income and so on for the people, the local people, would be these trees that are there. Now, he mentioned already, we've talked about this ash and hazel and alderwood clumps, plots in amongst the fields, which I guess provided some source of timber and, maybe house building materials and so on for their own use. But he also mentions that recently, in the last little while, lately, have been planted 200 acres of fir trees on a hill in the south side of the valley. That's there near the Loch Usi, obviously. So that's another source of work, isn't it? To be the planting and pruning and culling, or whatever the word is. Felling, I suppose. Harvesting. And we always talk about transport, don't we, when we're talking about these places? And I guess you could say that, first of all, that this parish is such a small distance because of its narrowness to many other parts. To go to your supermarket, you'd just walk into Dingwall, wouldn't you? Tesco would it be, wouldn't it? To do whatever. It's a market town, Dingwall. So whether there's a Tesco there or not, I'm not sure at that time. I think I could take a guess though. So,
Bruce, can I ask a question?
yeah.
I'm having trouble distinguishing Dingwall from the Bewley area. How far is Bewley from Dingwall?
I won't go back to the map, but Bewley is across the way. It's on the other river that comes out at the end of the Bewley Firth. So it's on the other side of the Black Isle, not far, maybe 2.5 hours walk.
Okay, thanks, Bill.
So you just got Urry. Bewley is just beside Urry Parish, which is the neighbouring parish to this one.
Well, I know that most of my family came from Bewley and a lesser number from Dingwall.
Yeah, that's it. They're not far away.
Okay.
Like in today's terms, 20-minute drive or something.
Okay.
So they're both at the ends of the two firths that go beside the Black Isle, which is not far across. You could walk it in a couple of hours. That's all. And with one of these horses, these many horses, you'd have no trouble at all. Be there in no time.
There you go.
You just listen to one podcast and you were there.
On horseback.
That's it. Like, in China, how they're all talking on their mobile phones while they're riding their bikes along.
No.
So you've got walking is obviously the big way of getting around, and most places are there are some quite good places to go on a Sunday walk from wherever you might live in this parish in the Strath Peffer Valley.
I can see 2 horses in this picture.
Yeah, look at that. Happy looking horses too, Barbara, aren't they? And this is not actually from this part of the world, but it gives you an idea of the sort of things that horses did. And I guess, they're crossing the rivers was a bit tricky, but apart from that, it was reasonably flat in the area where they operated, so that it wouldn't be all that hard to get around. And there were a lot of wheelwrights and McLennans were often wheelwrights in Dingwall, for example. The river Peffrey itself would be too narrow to use for any sort of transport use, and probably it's fair to say the Killearnan is a bit unreliable, a bit wild in that, like it's got gravel pools and things that make it difficult to navigate. You wouldn't really use it for Mississippi paddle steamers. So that's it. Now, this is the one I really like, this one here. This map, it's the one I used for the later publicity for this meeting today. And you can just get our bearings here again, so here's the river, the Strath Peffer, the Peffery River, or they call it here the water of Strath Peffer. Yeah, that's the name they give it. Here's Castle Leod up here, and here's the river going up in that direction as well as that direction, as we've seen before. And here's a rather odd spelling of Loch Usi. Yeah, it's spelling it E-U-S-Y, but still it's the same place. And Dingwall out of the parish, of course. And here's the river, the Killearnan, coming through here and going out to this muddy flats out here, and over here we've got Ferntosh, you can see it written there. So why we're talking about this is that if you come down, there's a place they're calling Usi, which we spell U-S-S-I-E, but they're spelling it E-U-S-Y. That's that funny S. Looks like an F. And down here, can you see that there? Just focus in on it. It says Mill of Usi. I want you to keep that in mind. Just store that away, because that'll be on the exam, that's for sure. I'm giving you a tip there. And there's a place here called Kilburn, which is, a place that you get mentioned a lot. This is a place here that we call Pit Glassy, but they call it Peter Glassy. It's the same place. And in here is where we today have Maryborough. In here. And look at this, there's a ford there marked on the map. That's an interesting thing. So, this is quite a sort of little industrial zone in here. There's a lot of work to be had in. It's not so much a town, but just a sort of more active, not just open farms, but things are happening here like grinding wheat, grinding grain, barley and oats mainly. and there's a ford across the river. And there's also at that time, not marked on here, but a thing called the Scuttle Ferry, or all sorts of spellings of this ferry, but it's about here where that ferry went over. But you could ford the river at low tide. This is the part here that's still tidal up to here. The high water mark, you know, for spring tides and things goes right up into here. And you've got this burn coming down here, the Usi burn, which is driving these mills, not just the grain mill here, but you also had a carding mill and a saw mill, a timber mill, lumber, what do you call it? Mill up in this area, driven by this burn coming down from the Loch Usi. Today, the Loch Usi is the water source for Dingwall. It's the town's water, the dam, you might say, supply for Dingwall. It was improved so that it held more water. But in those days, it was used as the burn from there was used for powering mills. How good is that? Providing work, occupations. And this part here was all part of the Brown estate, you know, the Seaforth Mackenzies. And the bridge then was put around about here, the Conan Bridge. It's a big deal, the Conan Bridge. It was a Telford Bridge, like so many others this time. The Bewley Bridge too was built at that time, called what's called the Lovett Bridge at Bewley, to make it possible. This is called the Great North Road, of course. It goes over the Lovett Bridge at Bewley, comes across the Black Isle there in Urry over to here, and this little line up here becomes the Great North Road going northward for, you know, traffic that didn't go on the ferry, the Kessock ferry at Inverness. So if you know, there was no big Kessock Bridge in those days, of course, not till really quite recently by comparison. And this was the road taking you to the north, to Sutherland and so on. Yeah. Let's think about the wages that these people might earn in these jobs that we've been talking about, these occupations. A man would, this is like the Big Mac index, you know that Big Mac index, they use it all around the world to tell how the real currency values compare to one to the other rather than using the exchange rates. Well, we're looking at that, how many days of work you need to do to be able to buy something. So a labouring man his wages would seldom exceed 6 pence a day. So those of you that didn't grow up with pounds, shillings and pence, Col and me know about it, don't we, Col? We know that there are 240 pence or 20 shillings in a pound, and therefore it would take 40 days for somebody earning 6 pence a day to make £1. A female servant, by comparison, would earn 5 pence a day, not that much less than a man. And servants hired for the whole year. This is like, you know, a continuation of the feudal system here we're talking about. A man would earn £3 for a whole year, plus some meal, you know, meaning crushed oats, usually, and 6 bolls. You remember, I'm a bit rough on what a boll is. Different bolls apply to different grains, but my rough thinking about it is that it's about the same size as a 200-litre drum. It's not really very accurate, but that's sort of my quick way of getting an idea of how much you're getting. 6 of them, that's quite a lot. What you might call a 44-gallon drum. Is that what is it in US dollars? A standard drum. US gallons. I don't even know whether they're greater or less than, I think they're a few more to a US gallon. Anyway, those big drums, that's the sort of thing. And a woman for her work for a year would earn £1 to 1, and I've put it in metric here, but you know, really it was £1, 15 shillings, 1.75 pounds a year, plus 5 bowls of meal. That's where no board was received. She'd get less, of course, if she was living in. So you can see how much. So by comparison, then you'd be able to use this money you'd earned up here to buy some beef or mutton. In terms of kilograms, you'd be able to buy 1 kilo, a little bit over 1 kilo of beef or mutton for your 1 day's labour, 7 pence compared to 6. So you'd need to work a day and a little bit to earn a kilo of beef or mutton. For pork, you'd be able to get it for your 1 day and have a bit left over, a bit of change, loose change. And then for chickens, you'd get, you'd only have to work 2/3 of a day to earn a chicken. There's the Big Mac index of its time there working. You like that, Catherine? Should be on the app, shouldn't it, really?
If you want, if a bushel, like a bowl has about 4 bushels in it, and one,
Yeah.
and there's about 9 gallons in a bushel.
Right. So 9
So
times
a bowl is 4 bushels.
4 bushels
what
and
they're
9.
doing.
And how many?
Yeah. And 9 liquid gallons would be what you
bushel.
get in a bushel. So
Okay. Yeah. So who knows? But that's and really, it's quite important to know that most of these people were actually paid. This is something we've seen so often, particularly in the years before the decade we're talking about. People were paid in grain, and they paid their rent and their whatever in grain. So that grain was really like the money at the time, like barter, rather than being paid coin or notes or EFT. They didn't get it on their credit card, that's for sure. So the rents that they're paying now, we've got the numbers in our head, the Big Mac index of how much you've got to earn to make a pound. So it takes you 40 days to earn £1, and then the 10 main farmers in this parish are paying about £40 sterling each year for their farms. Okay. The smaller tenants, of which there are many, 150 smaller tenants, yeah, they're paying between £2 and £16 sterling a year. Yeah, so that gives us an idea. The cotters, that's the people who, are exchanging the labour usually for their use of the land. So they're going to pay mainly in grain. Certainly these people will. Are paying somewhere between 2 shillings, that's 1/10 of a pound, and £2 for their use of their land where they have their kitchen garden and their home. A fairly temporary thing, probably, rocks that you could pull down and take somewhere else, and timbers too, roofing timbers. So he even says that their rents are chiefly paid in grain. Altogether, all these rents add up to about £1,400 that goes to the proprietors, of course, and the proprietors in turn have responsibility, to pay the stipend of the minister and to pay the schoolmaster probably, to finance some poor support, those sorts of things. Keep roads in reasonable condition. He says there are 8 proprietors of the land, but none reside in the parish, and presumably one of those is Seaforth, who lives in Rhan, which is not in this parish, just on the border there. But he doesn't actually say who they are, and I haven't gone into any detail there. I don't think we did at all go into any. Now, this is an interesting one, talking about the sort of nature of the morals of the people, you might say, the manners, he calls it, and the employment. He says that during the busy periods of work in the farms, they exert themselves to a great degree, is the phrase he uses. That's during the planting and the harvesting times, the 2 ends of the summer. But he says in the other seasons, there's a great want of industry, a very great want of industry, meaning there's not work available. having no field for similar exertions of industry, they indulge themselves to a great degree in indolence and inactivity. Now, at first when we saw this, Kathy, I remember your reaction to it. We thought this is a bit stiff, this minister having this go at his congregation, but we've seen it so often now that we have to note that this is what he says. What, you know, he was there at the time, he knew the people, and this is what we just can quote what he says and try and understand it. He does say, though, that some, the more industrious of both the men and the women, are forced to go south in the summer, May, June, and return in November to work in the farms in the south, you know, meaning like in the Lothians and parts around Edinburgh there, where they have bigger and more commercialised farms, you might call them. He says that sloth seems to be the greatest enemy of morality. At first I read that as being mortality, the biggest enemy of morality, sloth. And he goes on to say that they will do anything to procure spirits to which they are much addicted, and that you know, they'll basically steal is really what he's saying. You know, they don't not beyond thieving to get some money to buy some, presumably he means whiskey. I don't think they were big gin drinkers the way they are now in those times. So much addicted to spirits and go to every length to procure it. It's pretty damning, isn't it? On the poor roll, there are 50 people. So this gives you, it's a sort of other side of that thing. You know, they're poor, and it's funded by some funds from the Earl of Cromarty, and we're going to talk more about the Earls of Cromarty shortly, who provide some bowls of barley that is available. I guess they can use that to make illicit whiskey. What a good idea. There's interest on legacy, a fund that's been provided by a Mrs. Morrison from Jamaica. And of course, as you know, quite a few people from the Highlands went to the Caribbean to run plantations, be involved generally in the administration of plantations and the like there in the Caribbean and the north of South America too, Demerara and those parts. And there's a little bit collected from Sunday plate collections that goes towards the poor as well. But, you know, as usual, the poor are not too well treated. Everybody speaks the Gaelic, except for 2 residents who are unable to speak it very well. And then he says all but 2 are members of the one church that is in the parish. So you have to think that there's possibly a link between the 2 residents who can't speak the Gaelic and the 2 residents who are not part of the church, can't you? That would make sense. He doesn't say that, though. He says a schoolhouse was recently built and is in good repair. We don't get much of a clue about the numbers of students and so on that are attending the school the way we do from some of the other statistical accounts. And the minister receives, the schoolmaster receives a salary of just over £11. And by comparison, he says that his own salary is more in the area of £25 plus some other things, like he gets a glebe and some grain in addition to his £25. So you can see the schoolmaster's being paid considerably less, maybe less than 1/3 of the amount that the minister receives. Yeah. Clothing. Would you like to talk about clothing, Joyce? Had enough of me there now. No. You got it there. Use the slide.
Yeah, well, pretty well what you have there. I just did some research on, you know, the differences between the upper class and what the lower class could wear. muslin was fashionable, but wasn't practical for anybody who was actually working.
Mhm.
Cotton, you know, became more available as an import, and then from America with cotton, so producing cotton in the American. And this fabric, nankeen, colored cotton fabric in varied patterns, included a fabric called nankeen, and it says a tough yellow denim-like material which they use for shoes and for breeches. So it was kind of interesting. I bet you that was rather a rough fabric, eh? So, but you know, basically I looked at, you know, different websites just to see what there was, and you can spend a lot of time reading on the clothing if you like. So,
Yeah, interesting.
yeah, it is. So,
Cotton, of course, cotton, you know, the cotton gin was the big thing, wasn't it, in North America, in the
yeah,
South,
yeah.
in the South, and
The-
that
The
didn't happen.
cotton plantations, you know, like when they ran out of Englishmen to send over to work, then they got the slaves from Africa, sort of thing. So,
Yeah, that's it.
you know, like, but they had
And
to
it
run
was-
out of the English first. So,
Yeah, that's it. But
Yeah.
the cotton in North America didn't take off until the cotton gin was invented.
yeah, yeah,
That made it so much easier. Far fewer days were required then to clean the cotton before it was turned into thread.
yeah. It was a much more practical fabric too. So,
Yeah, and colourful. You know, all these patterns
yeah,
emerged. So just looking now, we'll go on back to some more particular cases, Joyce, in a minute. But looking at this parish and the number of McLennans we find here in this parish, it's quite extraordinary. Look at this pie chart for this one, for such a small area that's actually lived in. You know, it's not just the total area of the parish, but such a tiny little part of the world there. You've got it second most for births in a decade from 1800 to the 31st of December 1809. Second, only to Gairloch. And really Gairloch later becomes North Gairloch and South Gairloch. So if you actually took them out as separate parishes, you'd have FODDERTY being the biggest. How extraordinary would that be? And then 9% of the total of the pie chart of all the births that we have in our records. And I looked at the picture, the same graph for the decades going forward in the 1800s, and right up until the 1900s, it never got below the fifth biggest for births. We have 1,000 births altogether in our clan records for this parish, almost 1,000, 900 and something. Births in our records, and as you know, we don't go much past 1900. We're trying to focus on the 1800s. Typically, that's the typical thing. And we've got 1,000 births recorded in this parish, a lot. 150 marriages, and of course, deaths are not so well documented because there were no death records before 1855. So we don't know much about the deaths at that time. And then from there, many of these people went out to the world, you know, down to Glasgow or other parts of Scotland, or they went to maybe into Dingwall, maybe Inverness. They went to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, all over the place, these people. So it's a pretty important parish for us, actually, you know, not to be sneezed at. And it goes back quite a way. Here's an interesting case that we came across as part of the research. There's an Alan McLennan who leased the mill, the Usi Mill, in 1665. This fellow was the lessee of the Usi Mill that we saw on that old map there before, the Roy map. He got a lease with the Laird, Sir George Mackenzie of Tarbert. And it turns out that this Alan McLennan, the lessee, was the minister of Glenelg. What the hell's a minister in Glenelg doing with the lease of a mill? Anyway, that's what he had, the lease of a mill. And the lease covered the period 1665 to 1688. Oh, no, that's not right. that was when he was the minister. And it included the mill house and also a bit of area around it in the parish of Fodderty for 3 years. That's right. And this fellow, this Alan McLennan, minister of Glenelg, aka lessee of the mill in Fodderty, had a son who went on to become a minister himself, as we often see in these things. Once you got in the ministry circuit, you can be, your kids can become minister, at least one or two. And he was the minister in Fern, you know, that's up there near Tane, that we looked at fairly early on in this. And that's his number in our clan database there, I63785. Good number. Oh. Now, moving on a bit in time then to the time we're really focusing on, we've got a Donald McLennan Miller. He may even be of the same family, but it's a long time after the other one, isn't it? 120 years or something. And how do we know about him? Because this is the marriage register. I don't know how many of you have seen these marriage registers from the old parish register available on Scotland's People. And this is what, they're just homemade, you know, there's no formality about them. Different ones have different information and different ways of drawing it up for both the baptisms and the marriages. But this is a register for this parish for this period. You can see here 1792, 1792, 1793. And then down here it says Donald McLennan Miller, Mill of Ussy, to Catherine Mackenzie, daughter of Duncan Mackenzie. So that's a real case of where that real person earned his income in this period that we're talking about in this parish. You can see where it was that he worked by combining the register and what you try and figure out the place and so on. Once you know what this means, it all makes a bit more sense. He was a miller. It's a real genuine occupation. Now Joyce is going to talk about her relatives who live there, but just tell me when to change the slide, Joyce.
So this is my ancestor, Kenneth McLennan, and Kate Crompton and I, a cousin who are descended from this McLennan line, have been doing research for a few years, and we're trying to find George McLennan and Jane or Jean Chisholm, and they were from Kildoon. So Kenneth married Christy McRae, and from there the travels go to Barrow and Furness in Lancashire, like his son Kenneth, born in 1838. He married Catherine Monroe, and eventually they moved, and so it just follows down. We're pretty firm on this guy, tracking him. And then my grandmother is Beatrice McLennan, and the DNA that we did kind of proved it. She was born a Baines, but Kenneth McLennan was definitely her father. And they immigrated. She immigrated with her husband to Saskatchewan in 1926 with their 4 children. And Granddad Knight, actually, he tried to be an Australian. He wanted to go to Australia. He served in the Australian Army for six years for the duration of the First World War, but Granny wouldn't go to Australia because it was too far. So anyway, but we're pretty firm on Kenneth. And he was from Fodderty. The whole family seems to be all around that particular area. They have ties in Maryborough, and mostly it's Fodderty and Maryborough that I find them.
You see all these Foddertys here, don't you? Look at all that.
Yeah, they're pretty well focused in Fodderty. So
many
and this Kenneth worked on that railway. Like that was one of his later jobs. Like when the railway was being built, he was a surface man for the railway. So yeah, but it's interesting.
Maybe someone can talk about what surface men did on the railway.
Well, I would imagine they prepared the road beds and laid the tiles and all that sort of thing, or ties, like it would be pretty well labor intensive. Yeah. Like I would imagine they earned their pay doing it because there's no way around it. There was maybe they used horses, but not be that much.
Horses, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but no, I mean, they might have used the horses to get the ties there, but it was backbreaking work, I'm quite sure, so.
So this fellow, although he's said to be born in Dingwall, you know, he's from that Killearnan that's just so close to it's right on the
Yeah,
junction there of FODDERTY and
and
yeah.
actually that birth date is up for discussion,
Yeah, that's
because
right.
when we find 2 births for a Kenneth McLennan to this couple, and one is 1796 February and the other is 1797. So we kind of think that the first child might have died and the second one was reassigned that name. But there again, we can't prove it.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, this one was definitely born in 1797 because he lived. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Interesting.
there's a headstone for him. We go on to look at that if you like.
Yeah,
Bruce.
you can go on.
There's a headstone for him in the FODDERTY Cemetery, the wonderful
Yes.
FODDERTY Cemetery.
Yeah.
It's a great cemetery.
Yeah, and this was erected by his daughter Jane, so, and it's got, you know, all the relatives on it. So it's a good history there. So,
Yeah.
you know, some Duncan, Mary, like Mary is Kate's ancestor. So
That's it.
yeah. And Kate actually lives in Manchester, and we both watch these presentations. So, but I
Yeah.
watch it later than she does. So anyway, but that's pretty explanatory, but that's a very nice history tombstone. So
There's a little bit more yours.
yeah, and I struggled with Granny because she was born actually illegitimate. She had a sister and a brother born before the marriage. So I always wondered if I really had him Kenneth McLennan, because every document after that said that she was a McLennan. She was married as a McLennan. And so I thought, I did the DNA, and I had a contact with a person in Idaho who's related to this Donald. So when I did my DNA, she popped up as a cousin, boom. So it really cemented the fact that yes, Granny was, you know, a daughter of Kenneth McLennan. So, but the lady that I talked to in Idaho, she said, well, now she could have the DNA prove her lineage. She has a illegitimacy too that's not confirmed, but there again, it's a 3-for-1. My husband's Aunt Katie lived in Pocatello, and I have another member of his line, which is a French line, and they had relatives. So for some reason, Pocatello, Idaho is a big meeting ground for our families. So, but all through DNA, so it's really lots of fun.
Yeah.
Like as I said, Katie was a waitress, so she probably served Jane's descendants, and Jane married, you know, like she had 4 children, and there's lots of grandchildren. So, and they're all over Idaho. Some are in British Columbia. They moved around. So we populated the world. So anyway, you can move on.
Thank you, Joyce. That's great. Does anybody else have a direct connection with this, you know, like to tell us about their own family connection from FODDERTY? Just briefly, if you've got a family connection here, that would be, you'd be welcome to turn on your mic and talk about it. An opportunity. Oh, okay. So this is the cemetery where that headstone was that we were just looking at a minute ago. It's in this FODDERTY cemetery that we saw on the map there many times before. But the point of showing you this slide is that this mound in here is the mound where the church was in the 1790s. As I said, by the 1820s, that not that recent map, but more recent map showed the kirk further along to the west. But this mound is where nothing left of it, is what we say. Sources vary about how old the church was that was here at the time. Some say it had been there from as long ago as about, you know, the times before the Crusades. Whoa, how amazing is that? there was still something left of it, the ruin, in 1900. The manse nearby has that was there, the old manse that was there servicing this church was had a date on it. May not be right because some people write old dates, but that's what it's said to be, 1730. The new church was built along the road there, as we saw, in 1807. Mill Lane, it's called there where it is. A great cemetery, I'd recommend it. We've got some lovely gates there too, more war memorial gates than anything, but it's a great cemetery to visit. Very nicely done. I'll just talk a bit about the ministers themselves. This parish was created in 1600, so about the beginning of the Reformation, from 3 other parishes, one called FODDERTY and one called Killearnan. That's a name associated with what is now Strathpeffer village area, and Glen Usi, that was another parish at that time. So they were merged together in 1600 to become a single parish. And not that long after, one of the ministers there was called Farquhar McLennan, you might say, who was the minister there during quite difficult times for the church. This was the time of the Covenant and, the beheading of the king and the Commonwealth in England and the Bishops' War and all this sort of thing. It was a very turbulent time for religion. And he was demitted as the minister for this church in 1650 for malignancy, it's called. That's the term in the FASTI, but I know from work I did some time ago, the reason he was sacked, you might say, was that he had been asked to go into the Strathconan to conduct missions and, convert, baptize and so on, people to the modern ways of religion. But he refused to go because for fear of his life. He said it was too dangerous in the Strathconan, all those wild people who lived there. Some of your ancestors, Colin. Strathconan, that's the part where you all come from. Me too. He refused to go there and they defrocked him for it. Anyway, he repented his ways and said how wicked he'd been and was readmitted in 1655. And then not long after that, he went on to be the minister in Lochbroom. You might remember we saw him there in Lochbroom, and later we know that he went on to Skye. His son became a minister too, also called Farquhar. In 1662, this is an example of how turbulent the times were at that stage. John Mackenzie, who had been a minister in Urry in the very year that the covenant was signed, 1639, he opposed the covenant and felt obliged to flee to England because he was, out of favour with the main political movement. Political correctness, you might say, at the time, that everybody had to sign the covenant or they'd be in strife. So he found his way off to England to get out of the troubles, and then he went on to Ireland. But later he came back to FODDERTY in 1662. So not long after our friend Farquhar McLennan had left to go to Lochbroom, he came as the minister to this parish, and the bishop did an inspection. Remember, there were bishops just during that short time, no bishops anymore. Of course, that was a very controversial thing, having bishops, as part of the attempt to impose the English system on the Scots. Anyway, there was a bishop, and he came in 1665 to check out how our friend John Mackenzie was going with his works there, good work in the parish of FODDERTY. And he reported that communion had not been observed these 12 years bygone. Hadn't had communion for 12 years. That the people were not wholly examined, but that Roderick, the son of the minister, did sometimes preach and catechize. The minister himself didn't even do the preaching. So it was a bit of a slack operation in the 1660s there in FODDERTY. Give you an idea. Now, just looking at the father of the current minister, who was called Colin Mackenzie. He's known as Colin Mackenzie of Glack. Glack is a place in Aberdeenshire. was admitted to this parish in 1735. So he's he started there quite a long time before Donald, the author of the statistical account, was born. He was the son of Roderick of Bray. Remember, we saw Bray on the map, and Longcroft, wherever that is, Chamberlain of Lewis, and the daughter of William Munro of this place, Dully, which is actually there in FODDERTY. It's near Maryborough, vaguely in that direction. He studied, he was educated at King's College, a really old institution at Aberdeenshire, got an MA in 1728, and was presented by George, the Earl of Cromarty. That's, very important to this parish, and we'll deal with those earls shortly. He was presented, that means, that he was sponsored by the Earl from the Castle Laird, became a chaplain in the 73rd Foot, known as MacDonald's Highlanders, because the Earl had this name MacDonald in his title, in 1778. And look at this, that castle we saw when we were doing the Dingwall parish. You remember we saw the castle that was later pulled apart by our friend Captain Donald McLennan and built his own home out of the former castle that was the seat of the Earls of Ross. Well, this castle was inherited from his mum by this minister of FODDERTY. That's pretty good, isn't it? And he flogged it off, you might say. He sold the castle of Dingwall and bought the Glack estate in Aberdeenshire in 1765. So about the time he's, thinking, oh, well, I've got this castle, the castle in Dingwall, quite a famous thing. I'll just flog that off to somebody, I don't know who. Maybe the person who sold it to Captain Donald so he could pull it apart. So that's a good thing, isn't it, tying those things together there. He had a number of children, of course, this Colin Mackenzie, the minister, the father of the current minister who wrote the statistical account. One of them was a son, Forbes, who was born 1769, and he became a major in the Ross-shire militia, but was a noted agriculturalist. And he married the daughter of that minister that we saw in Dingwall. You remember Reverend John Kennedy, DD, Doctor of Divinity, that we saw in Dingwall. They're famous preachers, those Kennedys, the John Kennedy and his son. Were later involved in some of the Black Isle parishes. And he had a daughter who married a Reverend Colin Mackenzie, that's the same name, who was a missionary in the Strathconan. And this fellow reported that in 1811 that the parish is very destitute, both of religious and secular instruction, blah, blah, blah. Hardly anybody can speak or read Gaelic or English. And I've mentioned already that some of the ministers in FODDERTY often looked after Strathconan. So you can see here there's this interconnection anyway, that the minister who's there in this period we're talking about, 1789 to 1815, was the son-in-law of one of the daughters of the FODDERTY minister. This 1815, that's when my own ancestors went to the Strathconan after the Napoleonic Wars there. And so the current minister himself was born just before that Forbes that we just saw a minute ago. He's just a slightly older brother of Forbes. And he was appointed to as assistant and successor. That's a term that's used often where, like, you don't want to kick out the old minister, you want to appoint an assistant to have with the view to him taking over the role of minister. It's a sort of nice way of handling the transition, the succession. And that's how it's expressed quite often in the church. You see that assistant and successor. It's like saying you're the heir to this job. You're the, what's it called? You know, where you get, you're favoured to take it on. And he's called John Mackenzie Lord MacLeod. You see that? He's taking that MacLeod name, even though, you know, he's a Mackenzie by name. The fellow who presents him. He's the Castle Leod person, John Mackenzie. He becomes chaplain of the 71st Foot, and the Fasti reports that he undertook considerable work for the church. He had quite an interest in church administration and affairs. I guess he was grown up with it, eh? He married firstly Mary, son of a John Mackenzie, there's a name, but that family was from Bray, which is in FODDERTY, so that's good. They had children. He secondly married Mary Fyers, the daughter of this Thomas Fyers, overseer of the King's Works, but they didn't have any children. And he died, unusual death. He died by falling off a ladder when he was reaching for a book in his library. You don't see that often. Now, I should have said somewhere there, I don't know where I should have mentioned it, but oh no, I'll mention it in a minute, sorry. So this is that Castle Leod I said we'd get back to. So now we're back to it. So this was part of the Mackenzies' expansion eastward after the Battle of Harlaw in 1411, as we saw in that map of where we saw the Mackenzies' expansion, both out to Lewis and also through the Strathconan and the Garve and so on over to the Black Isle. Remember in Dingwall we saw it a lot. We talked about that because that was like the cutting edge there. Anyway, so Shari can talk about this better than I can, but anyway, the brother of the Seaforth Laird, or the Kintail Laird as he was called at that time, the Kintail chief of Kintail in his title, his brother became the tutor to his oldest son, and the brother was called Sir Roderick or Rory, and he was the progenitor of this line called the Earls of Cromarty or Cromarty, and eventually took over the role of clan chief, as they would claim to be today, through various machinations, including some daughters along the way. That okay, Shari, if I ruined that? You can improve on what that'll do. It's a rough and ready version, but this Castle Leod is from the line that descended from the tutor of Kintail, as he's called, Roderick, and his son becomes Sir John, who's a baronet of Nova Scotia, and then they go on to George, who is called the first Earl of Cromarty. He's the one who we saw the Leaning Tower for. You remember the Leaning Tower in Dingwall the meeting just before last, where we had, when he died, they put up the tower that later leant over a bit and is still marked by the memorial that's there, but not with the Leaning Tower. It's different in the car park near the church. Yeah, Leaning Tower there. He died in 1714. And then the second Earl of Cromarty was known for his allegiance with the Jacobites. And then his son, the third Earl, George, is very enthusiastic about Jacobites, and such that he doesn't actually attend Killearnan because he's captured just the day before up near Tain, you know, that Mickle ferry that we saw up there. He gets captured just the day before the Killearnan battle, and he's destined for the chop. But his wife interceded, and he was reprieved. So that's the long. But in the meantime, the estates, the title had been dissolved, or whatever the word is, and stripped of his title, and the estates forfeited, confiscated. But the interesting thing is that this Colin, the minister, was administering, was the factor, they say, the factor, to the estates of this laird during the period of forfeiture. Colin the Minister, the father of Donald. Yeah. Just to give you a feel for how extensive the estates of the Earls of Cromarty were. I won't read you all of this because it's a bit dull and tedious, but you know, this is a summary that you find from, I think, Joyce, is it from the Edina site where we get the statistical accounts from? I think that's where it comes from. And maybe it's quoting the Gazetteer. But anyway, this is how we come to use this term Ross and Cromarty as the name of the county rather than just Ross Shire, which is the more colloquial version. People, you might say, why do we do that? Well, we're going to see the answer here today, because it was really the ascendancy of this branch of the Mackenzies that, you know, they were men to be feared, not to be messed with, and they acquired much territory throughout what was then called Ross Shire, such that it says here that although Cromarty is just a small little parish up there near Tame, in fact, the areas you see there, it had scattered what they called pendicles. There's a word I haven't heard before. Scattered pendicles throughout the rest of the lands, you know, mainly Ross Shire, of 220,000 acres. A bloody lot. So this is why the Earl pressed for the name Cromarty to be included with Ross Shire always, when, and so mentioned in the one breath. You know, we talk about the two sort of like as if it's one, Ross and Cromarty. So, you know, if you hear that, you wonder why there's that extra name in there. Well, that's because it's only one little parish in Ross Shire. It's not really the case. It's that there were these, and we've seen it on many of these old maps with the coloured in area, like we saw in Gairloch, you know, up there, or Loch Broom, that was a better one. In Loch Broom, up in the top corner, the northern part of Loch Broom parish, huge tracts of land up there were owned by the Earl of Cromarty, and so that's just one example. They're all over the place. You like to add anything to that, Shari? You're gone. Okay. Here's a book that we're going to treat with a bit of suspicion, but you know, it's it sets out to be quite an interesting book. It's about the Strath and the town, a biography. It's out of print now. You can't, although you seem to be able to buy it, you can't actually go and get it. You can get some second-hand copies somewhere. Did you want to add anything, Shari, to what I was saying about Mackenzies? It's your chance.
No, I think you've covered that enough.
Okay.
We're just so intertwined with McLennans in
Yeah.
all of the families, I'm sure, but you've covered the basics. That's good.
Basics.
It's no problem. John and I both come from female descendants from that particular family, so.
The tutor, the Kintails line.
Right, and the Cromartys, yeah.
Yeah. So this book is dealing with, thank you, Shari. This book is dealing with the Strath. You can't buy it anymore out of print original, but you can get second-hand copies. And this, but you can get the flip book from this here. So if you look up the book and the author, Clarence Finlayson, you can easily go and read the flip book at this site here, rossandcromartyheritage.org. It's got a few quirky things, you know. This is where it talks about how the minister was the factor for the forfeited estates of the Cromarty lairds. Both he and his son did fine work, bringing more prosperity to the district, it says. The Earl's son, John MacLeod, was an officer very anxious to prove his loyalty to the government. So this is the times after Killearnan, right? He says that they're trying to, you know, win themselves back in favour with the Hanoverians, you might say. And and so when he advertised for recruits for the American Revolutionary War, also known as the 13 Colonies, he is said to have got a good response from the local lads turning up to go and fight in North America. Someone else, though, found me a quote from a family that had been passed down in that family's history from FODDERTY, where they talked about ways of avoiding the what are they called? You know, the recruiters. What's the term? Press gang. You know, the press gangs coming around to recruit, that they'd found ways of dressing up as a, you know, invalid and whatnot to avoid being taken away. So there are probably two sides to this story. It said that when they returned home, many of them lived on those heights area there. So some of these people could be from the heights. They could have been to North America and back. It then says that, you know, this is a bit, someone told me this is just not right, this thing that this fellow says, and that the person who told me, I believe, he knows so much about the history of this parish. He says that, you know, they had intended to create two big farms, but when the people were being cleared from the Strathconan, they were given, the homeless refugees, you might call them, from the Strathconan were given small farms on the heights. Well, you know, the Strathconan generally was not like cleared in the big sense. There were movements around, of course, as we've seen there, but the bigger sort of numbers leaving didn't leave till well after the time this is talking about. They didn't leave there till like 1839, that sort of date. So a bit tongue-in-cheek about that. Just treat it with a bit of caution, that's all I can say. So, Curiosities, we're on a last leg here, I'm sorry to say. I know you've been enjoying it. There's this thing here, this stone. When I first went many years ago to try and find this stone, I got a bit lost in Strathpeffer and couldn't, eventually I found it, but it was a bit disappointing. There are very few stones of any sort there. Anyway, it's quite a handsome looking stone and thought to be very old, you know, very like medieval and maybe even earlier stone. Maybe as early as, you know, the 800s. It's thought that it possibly was moved from somewhere else, maybe further down stream, where, you know, where the churchyard is that we know today, up to this point. And some say, and it might just be associating two things that actually are not related. Some say that it commemorates the Battle of 1411. We know this was quite a controversial time when the McDonalds were fighting a rearguard action to their being evicted from Ross-shire. That in 1411 there was a battle, and the winning Munros were buried here at this site, and the stone was reused. What's the word? Anyway, was used. An existing stone was used. What's the word? Repurposed. Yeah, so it was repurposed to make the heads, mark the place where the Munros had been buried following their successful battle with the McDonalds. The two might just be being conflagrated, you know, without actually being right. But there was obviously, the two things did exist, but do they relate to each other? Who knows? The other thing we want to mention here is this thing that we started off on the map seeing so often, this amazing, unique feature. We said how strategic this part of the world was, not just for growing crops, but for passage through from the east to the west, that people would go to Dingwall and come on through here, through the Compton and the Strathgarve and up and into the west coast to Gairloch and down to the Loch Carron and so on. So this is quite an important place to have defensive buildings, as we see in more recent times with the Mackenzie forts and castles and whatnot. But, you know, going back for a really long time to the Bronze Age, this hill provided a natural fort, as we saw in the hill forts aerial photo. And on it is said to be a vitrified, fort, which means that the walls are meant to be like glass, you know, they've been sand and whatnot have been heated to such an extent that it's turned into glass. Well, there might be a bit of it left, and credible sources say that. I can't say I've seen it, I haven't been there to see it, but it's a unique sort of feature. So what I recommend you might like to do, should you be interested, is when you go to this part of the world, you can easily go to this website, walkhighlands.co.uk, and get the blow-by-blow description of the walk and how to do it and where to turn and what to take with you and so on. It's just a 2-hour walk from Strathpeffer car park there in this Blackmore Wood car park, and you just go out along that valley there and up to this higher level that you see. This is the higher level here, and you walk along the higher level, go up to this another interesting spot, and then go back. 2-hour walk. Something you can do there. And here's this Loch Usi here. Here's the Usi burn coming down here that has the mills on it. So it just helps you to, relate to the area, doesn't it? If you can go and poke around in these places. Here's Brown Wood, related to Brown, the Mackenzie HQ, and so on. There's Jamestown there. You can see how big it is or how small. So on. This is a thing. Would you like to talk about this, Joyce?
Okay, this is an old, you can see the heading there, it's Old Scottish, but they had a rather interesting thing. Let me find my notes.
So we recently used it to get hold of, they looked up for us and charged us, we paid them to
Oh yeah, everything is.
some Kirk session minutes. And they did quite a good job.
They had the numbers of the McLennans per 100,000. It was quite a bit, quite a bit up there. So it was kind of an interesting site for you to look at. But it gave the different spellings, like, it wasn't written in stone that it had to be McLennan. It could be no C at all, or it could be just one N. So it's just they gave a whole bunch of the numbers, and I thought it was just an interesting site.
Yeah.
And I looked when I looked at it, so
it might be helpful for you, mightn't it? Some of you here in doing it.
It just kind of reinforced that, how many McLennans were in the parish at the time. And, like they really, you say there was a lot of people in FODDERTY named McLennan. Well, in the whole parish, I think there was. So, yeah. But anyway, if you want to look at that site, like you don't want to order anything, but they have a lot of stuff you can look at, and you can find, all kinds of interesting things. So,
just another source. Thanks, Joyce. It's a good
just
idea.
Another thing to look at,
Yeah.
When you get browsing, you never know what you find, eh? So.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for that. So let's just look at what we've dealt with today. We hope that we've covered this parish of FODDERTY in the 1790s. We've thought about some of the ways people might make their living or their life there, where it's located, what it's like there, what sort of health they might have enjoyed or not, how many McLennans you might find there in this part of the world, who the Lairds and the Minister were, and just a couple of curiosities to finish off the day today.